Savannah, Georgia teaches everyone who lives there the same lesson, eventually. It teaches it through the squares, those 22 city squares that the British planned and the Americans kept, each one a small park in the middle of the city, each one shaded by live oaks so old they have seen everything the city has ever done. You walk through Savannah and you walk through the squares, and the squares slow you down, because you cannot move through a live oak's shadow without feeling the specific quality of time that the tree has accumulated. Savannah is a city that is always telling you to stop rushing, to look, to understand that what is in front of you has a depth you have not yet fully seen. Before this story breaks your heart and rebuilds it again, please subscribe to this channel, ring that bell, and drop a comment below telling me which town or city you're listening from tonight. I read every single one. Jolene Briggs had grown up in Savannah. She had walked those squares her whole life, to school, to work, in the evenings when the heat broke, and the river sent a breeze through the city, and the Spanish moss moved like slow breath in the live oaks. She had sat on the benches in those squares, and she had thought the thoughts you think when you are a person with a lot to think about, and the squares give you permission to take the time it requires. She had grown up the eldest of four in a house on the east side of the city that was small and exactly large enough, and full of the specific music of a house where the television was always on, and someone was always cooking, and the front door was never locked, because the neighborhood knew the family, and the family knew the neighborhood. She had been 20 years old when she enlisted in the army, not because Savannah had not been enough. Savannah was always enough. It was a city she had loved her whole life and would love until she died, and she knew it. She had enlisted because she had the specific character of someone who needed to be tested, not to prove something to anyone else, to know for herself what she was capable of. She had needed to find the edge of herself and see what was there. The army had shown her. 8 years of it, 4 of them in Afghanistan, in conditions that found the edge of most people, and that found the edge of Jolene and showed her something she had not expected, that past the edge, past the place where ordinary endurance stopped, there was something else. Not superhuman ability, not fearlessness. Something humbler and more durable than either. The ability to stay with a person who was broken and frightened and bleeding, and to not look away from any of it, to be completely present with the worst thing and not be diminished by it. To keep your hands steady and your mind clear, and your voice level in the middle of situations that were designed by the specific cruelty of war to produce panic. She had stayed. Every time. In 8 years and 4 deployments, and the specific mathematics of how many times someone in her position encountered a moment that asked everything, she had stayed every time. She had come home at 28 with 2 commendations she did not display, and a body that worked correctly, and a mind that worked correctly by most measures, and the specific weight of someone who has stayed with too many worst moments and who needs, for a while, to be somewhere quiet. Savannah was quiet, or it was quiet enough. The squares were there, the Spanish moss was there, the river was there. She spent 3 years doing ordinary things and finding ordinary things insufficient, not because they were small, because she was a person who needed her hands, doing something that mattered, and ordinary things did not, for her, constitute mattering at the level she required. She enrolled in the pediatric nursing program at 31. Someone at the VA, a counselor she had been seeing intermittently, a woman with the specific quality of insight that came from decades of listening to people like Jolene, had suggested it, not as career advice, as a hunch. Jolene had thought about it for 3 weeks and had enrolled because she had nothing better to try, because the counselor's hunches had proven reliable before. The hunch was an understatement. Something about the children unlocked something in Jolene that had been locked for a long time. She had thought, before the program, that her experience in combat medicine had made her good at the clinical elements of nursing, and that the human elements would require learning. The opposite was true. The clinical elements she absorbed quickly, and with the efficiency of someone building on an existing foundation. The human elements she had already, fully, without knowing it. the ability to stay present with a frightened person, to not flinch at the worst parts, to tell the truth in a way that helped rather than harmed, to hold someone's hand through the moment they were most afraid of, and to communicate, through the holding, that they were not alone in it. She had been doing this for 8 years in Afghanistan. She had simply never done it with a stethoscope with a small cartoon dinosaur charm on it. She was 34 years old. She worked the day shift at Savannah Children's Medical Center, which was one of the better pediatric hospitals in the state, and which had hired her 3 years ago, and which had, in the time since, understood that it had gotten something unusual in Jolene Briggs, but had not fully been able to articulate what. The children could articulate it. The children always could. They asked for her by name. They cried less when she was on the floor. The ones who had been there long enough to have preferences had preferences, and their preference was Jolene, and the other nurses took no offense, because they understood that the preference was not a judgment of them, but a recognition of something specific that Jolene had. She arrived at Savannah Children's on a Thursday morning at 6:45 a.m. She parked 2 blocks away, because the hospital parking was always full at this hour, and she liked the walk through the square anyway. She walked through Forsyth Park, which was the largest of the Savannah squares, where the fountain ran and the live oaks were so large their canopies touched overhead, and the morning light came through the Spanish moss in the specific way it came through Savannah light in October, warm and golden and slightly heavy, the quality of light in a city that has been accumulating beauty for a very long time. She walked into the hospital. She said good morning to the security desk, to the reception staff, to the 2 parents she passed in the lobby who were carrying the specific expression of people who had been in a children's hospital long enough to have learned where the good coffee was. She changed. She put on her teal scrubs. She clipped her badge. She looped the stethoscope, the one with the dinosaur charm that a patient named Marcus had given her 18 months ago when he was discharged because he wanted her to have something that made her smile when she used it. She picked up the morning report. She went to her floor. She had no idea that by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the floor was going to ask everything she had. 7:14 a.m. The morning shift on a pediatric ward had a specific quality that Jolene had come to think of as the opening of a show. The ward waking up, the night nurses doing their final rounds, the first sounds of children who were alert enough to be vocal, the specific mixture of clinical activity and human warmth that was the signature of a children's hospital running well. She went to the nurses' station and received the handover from the night charge, a man named Devon who had worked the pediatric ward for 11 years and who communicated patient status in the efficient shorthand of someone who had done this 10,000 times. She went through the list. 11 patients today. She absorbed each one with the dual attention that had become natural to her, the clinical picture and the human picture held simultaneously. Room 3, Marcus, 9, post-surgical, day 6, doing well. She had a standing relationship with Marcus that involved daily negotiations about the acceptability of hospital food, which he found deeply unacceptable, and which she agreed with on principle while maintaining on practical grounds. She was looking forward to this morning's negotiation. Room 5, twins, 4 years old, Lily and Sam, admitted 2 days ago with the same respiratory infection acquired simultaneously, which their parents described with the exhausted dark humor of people who had been keeping up with twins for 4 years, and had accepted that their children operated as a unit in both health and illness. Both improving. Lily was going to be ready to go home in 2 days. Sam was going to take 3 more, which was going to be a logistical problem for the parents Jolene was already thinking about how to address. Room 8, a new admission overnight. A teenager, 15, admitted for reasons that were documented one way, and that Jolene read another way and filed for careful attention and the specific kind of presence that didn't announce itself. She continued through the list. Room 11, Cora Hayes, 7 years old, 3 weeks inpatient. She paused on Cora's name the way she paused on it every morning. Not because Cora's situation was the most clinically complex on the floor. It was not, though it was serious. Because Cora was the kind of child who had gotten into Jolene in the specific way that some patients did. Not because Jolene favored her. She was careful about this. She did not favor patients. But because Cora had a specific quality of life force that was remarkable in a 7-year-old, and that made her illness feel particularly wrong. Cora was funny. Cora was unafraid of adults in the way that some children were unafraid. She spoke directly. She asked the questions she wanted answered. She had opinions about the quality of the morning television programming and expressed them with the confidence of a critic. She had been making art since her first week on the ward. Drawings, paintings with the art therapy supplies, a series of paper animals that now occupied every available surface of her room. The G80 Well Soon card on the outside of her door had been made by her younger brother, who was 5 and who had visited every weekend and who had, on his 3rd visit, solemnly presented Jolene with a drawing of a nurse that was Jolene from the specific perspective of a 5-year-old boy, which was to say that it bore no physical resemblance to Jolene, but captured something essential about how he perceived her. Jolene had taped it to her locker. Cora's father, Raymond Hayes, 41, a contractor from a town 30 miles outside Savannah, had been in the hospital almost as long as Cora. Not continuously. He had a business to run, a younger child at home, the specific impossible logistics of a parent whose child was seriously ill, but he was there more than he was absent. Jolene had brought him coffee twice, not because it was her job, but because she had looked at him sitting in the waiting room and had seen the specific exhaustion of someone who was not going to ask for anything and needed something. She had also noticed, with the attention she brought to everything in her environment, that Raymond Hayes had been on the phone 3 times in the corridor outside's room in the last week, and that the calls had the quality of arguments, the specific tension of someone fighting for something through official channels and losing. She had meant to ask him about it. She had not found the moment. She was going to find it today, she decided. She had learned that the things you meant to do and did not were the ones that caught up with you. She picked up her first chart. She went to Marcus's room to begin the morning negotiation about breakfast. Raymond Hayes had been fighting the insurance company for 19 days, the treatment that Cora's oncologist had recommended, a specific targeted therapy that had shown strong results in children with Cora's diagnosis, had been denied. The first denial had come 8 days after Cora's admission. Raymond had appealed. The appeal had been denied 12 days later. He had filed a second appeal with the supporting documentation from 3 physicians, including a specialist he had driven to Atlanta to see and had paid for out of pocket. That appeal had been denied 4 days ago. The insurance company's position was that the therapy was experimental. The oncologist's position was that the data was clear and the therapy was the correct treatment for Cora's specific case. The insurance company's position had not changed. Raymond had called his state representative's office. He had called the insurance commissioner's office. He had called a legal aid organization that dealt with insurance denials. He had called a journalist who covered healthcare stories. He had not slept properly in 19 days. On Thursday morning, he had arrived at the hospital at 7:30 a.m. and gone directly to the office of the hospital's patient advocate, a woman named Sandra, who had been helping him navigate the appeals process and who had called him the previous evening to tell him that the second appeal had been denied, and that she did not know what other options were available within the system. He had sat in Sandra's office for 20 minutes. He had asked the questions he needed to ask. He had received the answers that were available. He had walked out of Sandra's office and down the corridor and through the door to the pediatric ward, which he had access to because he was a parent of a patient, and he had walked to the east wing where Cora's room was. He had not planned what happened next. This was the truth, and it was important. He had not gone to that hospital that morning with the intention of harming anyone. He was not that man. He was a man who had been fighting for his daughter for 19 days, through every available, legitimate channel, and who had run out of channels, and who had walked into a corridor, in a children's hospital, in a state of despair, so complete that the ordinary boundaries of his behavior had dissolved. The weapon was his. He had a license for it, legal, purchased years ago, carried occasionally for the specific reasons a contractor sometimes carried in the areas where he worked. He had not brought it to the hospital intentionally. It was in his truck. He had gone back to the truck, after Sandra's office, for his phone charger. He had not thought about the weapon when he picked up the phone charger. He had put the charger in his jacket pocket and walked back to the hospital. He had been walking down the East Wing corridor when 2 nurses had come out of a room, and he had felt the specific unbearable pressure of 19 days, and a second appeal denial, and a daughter who was sick and getting sicker, and a therapy that existed and worked, and that no one was going to give her. And something had broken open in him, and his hand had gone to his jacket pocket, and the world had become the situation it became. He had not hurt anyone. He had not threatened anyone specifically. He had stood in the corridor with 3 people near him, 2 nurses who had been in the wrong place, and a child in a wheelchair who had been coming back from imaging. And he had been unable to move and unable to speak and unable to think clearly about anything, except the denied appeal and his daughter's face. The police had been called. The negotiator had come. The negotiator had called on the phone that Raymond had not answered, because he did not know what to say, and because every official voice had been telling him no for 19 days, and he could not hear another official voice. Jolene had been told about the situation at 2:07 p.m. She had listened to everything. The police commander's briefing, the negotiator's assessment, the status of the 3 people in the corridor with Raymond. She had asked 4 questions, all of them specific. She had thought for 45 seconds. Then she had said, "Let me try." 2:19 p.m. The police commander had not wanted to let her try. She had understood this, and she had not been impatient with it. He was doing his job. His job required him to assess risk, and to weigh the risk of sending an unarmed nurse into a barricade situation against the potential benefit. The assessment, from where he stood, was not favorable. She had told him 3 things. First, the man in the corridor was not a threat in the conventional sense. He was a father in crisis. She knew the difference because she had seen both, and Raymond Hayes had none of the indicators of someone who intended violence. He had the indicators of someone who was drowning. Second, the negotiator was not reaching him because the negotiator was an official voice, and Raymond Hayes had been failed by official voices for 19 days, and adding another one was not going to help. Third, she knew him. But she had brought him coffee and she had spoken to him in the corridor, and she had sat with his daughter, and she was not an official voice. She was the nurse who knew Cora's name. The commander had looked at her for a long moment. "You understand that if he fires that weapon, I understand," she said. "Let me try." He had let her try. She had walked down the East Wing corridor alone. She had not asked for a weapon. She had not asked for backup behind her. She had walked the way she walked everywhere, like she belonged, which she did. This was her floor. These were her children. The man at the end of the corridor was the father of one of them. She stopped at 15 feet from Raymond Hayes. He had heard her coming. He turned. He recognized her. She could see this, the specific flicker of recognition in a face that was otherwise beyond ordinary expression, walled off by 19 days of exhaustion and fear and the specific horror of what he had accidentally done. Raymond. "Not, sir. Not Mr. Hayes." Raymond. Because she knew him. He did not lower the weapon. "I need you to go away," he said. His voice, rough. She could hear the exhaustion in it and the shame and, underneath both, the specific desperation of someone who had not slept in too long. "I know," she said. "I'm going to stay anyway. Is that okay?" He stared at her. "Why would you do that?" he said. "Because you brought me coffee," she said, "and I haven't returned the favor." He stared at her for a long moment. "That doesn't make any sense," said. "No," she agreed. "Can I sit down?" He said nothing. She sat down on the floor of the corridor, cross-legged, the way she sat on the floor of patient rooms with children who needed her at their level, her hands visible, her body language the complete opposite of threat. The second appeal was denied, she said, not a question. She had known about the appeals. She had been paying attention. He was very still. How did you were on the phone 3 times this week in Cora's corridor, she said. I recognized what those calls sounded like. I've been in rooms where people were getting bad news for a long time. I should have asked you about it sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. Something moved across his face. Not the wall coming down. Not yet. But a crack in it. The specific crack that occurred when someone who had been alone with something for too long heard a voice acknowledge that the thing was real. They said it's experimental, he said. It isn't, she said. I've read the data. Cora's oncologist is right. It's the correct treatment. Then why? Because the system is wrong in specific ways that have specific consequences for specific children, she said. And you've been fighting that system for 19 days, and nobody with the power to actually change the outcome has listened to you. He looked at her. Has anyone actually listened to you? She said. The question landed the way she had intended it to land, not as a rhetorical, as a real question. My wife, he said, Sandra, the advocate. You, a pause. That's it. Then I'm going to listen now, she said. Tell me everything, from the beginning. Tell me exactly what they said and when, what you asked for and what they told you. I want all of it. He looked at her for a very long moment. Then he started talking. He talked for 22 minutes. She listened the way she had always listened, completely, without the part of her mind that was preparing her response running ahead of his words. The first thing a good combat medic learned was to hear exactly what a patient said, rather than what they expected to hear, because patients in extremis sometimes could not say the thing directly, and the indirect version contained the actual information. She had learned to hear underneath language, to track what was not said as carefully as what was. Raymond Hayes said many things in those 22 minutes. He said, the first denial had come with a letter that contained language about experimental treatments that he had looked up and found applied to techniques developed in the previous decade, not to the therapy his daughter's doctor had recommended. He said, when he had called to appeal, the person on the phone had been polite and had explained the process and had given him a case number and had not been able to tell him who reviewed appeals or what criteria they used. He said, the second appeal had been reviewed in 12 days, which was within the company's stated timeline, and had been denied with a letter that used the same language as the first denial, which suggested that no one had read the additional documentation he had submitted. He said, his daughter had been in this hospital for 3 weeks. He had watched her. He had watched the treatment she was receiving doing some things, but not the thing her doctor said was needed. He had watched the week-by-week assessments. He could read the trend. He was not a medical professional, but he was her father, and he could read the trend. He said, he had not meant for this to happen. He said this 3 times, in 3 different ways, and each time Jolene heard that he meant it completely, and that the not meaning it was part of what had broken him. That a man who had never harmed anyone, and would never harm anyone, had found himself standing in a hospital corridor with a weapon in his hand, and 3 frightened people near him, and no understanding of how he had gotten there. She said nothing during his 22 minutes. She nodded. She made the small sounds that meant, I hear you, continue. Once she asked a clarifying question about a specific claim the insurance company had made, because she wanted to understand the exact language. When he finished, he was quieter. Not calm, not yet, but the specific exhaustion that came after the thing that had been held too long was finally released. She recognized this from the field. People who had been in pain for a long time sometimes went quiet after they spoke it out loud, not because the pain was gone, but because the act of being heard had temporarily lifted the pressure. She sat with the quiet for a moment. I want to tell you something, she said. And I want you to know that I am telling you this because it's true, not because I'm trying to manage you or move this situation toward an outcome. If I wanted to do that, I would have led with it. I'm telling you this now because I've heard everything you said, and this is what I think you need to know. He looked at her. The appeal process has a third tier, she said. Not all insurance companies publish this. It involves a request for independent external review by a state-licensed medical reviewer who is not affiliated with the insurance company. The decision of the external reviewer is binding. Sandra knows about it. She may not have had time to explain it to you. But it exists, and based on what you've told me about the clinical documentation you've submitted, the external reviewer would be reading a very strong case. He stared at her. Why didn't anyone tell me that? He said. Because the system is complicated and people are overwhelmed, and the information doesn't always get to the people who need it when they need it, she said. That's not an excuse. It's the truth and it's wrong. A pause. Is this real? He said. A third appeal. It's real, she said. I can take you to Sandra's office right now and we can start that process today. Today, before the end of business. He was very still, and then, from the ward behind him, a monitor alarm sounded. Not Cora's room. She knew the sound pattern of every monitor on this floor. It was room 3. Marcus. A routine alarm, oxygen saturation dip, the kind that self-corrected and required a check but not a crisis response. Raymond Hayes did not know this. He turned toward the sound. His face became the face of every parent who had been in a children's hospital for 3 weeks. The automatic terror of an alarm, the visceral certainty that it was the worst thing, the impossibility of not responding. That's not Cora, Jolene said immediately. That's room 3. It's routine. Cora is fine. He turned back to her. His face was a man who had just learned, for 1 second, what it felt like to believe his child's alarm was sounding. The weapon was at his side. He had not noticed it go there. She stood up, slowly, hands visible. She took 1 step toward him. Give it to me, she said, quietly. Not a command, an offer. He looked at his hand, at the weapon, at her face. He handed it to her. And then he sat down on the floor of the corridor the way she had been sitting, just sat down suddenly, as if his legs had made the decision before his mind caught up. His hands went to his face. His shoulders moved. She crouched beside him. She did not touch him. She was present. She was there. We're gonna fix this, she said. Not a promise she was certain she could keep in every particular. A promise she was going to do everything in her power to keep. Cora is going to get the treatment. I am going to help you fight this today. He lifted his face. Why? He said. She thought about this for a moment. About the true answer. Because she's my patient, she said. And because you're her dad. And because it's the right thing to do. And because I've been in situations where nobody came. And I always said that if I ever got to be the one who could come, I would. He looked at her. The police came around the corner. She stood up. She held up 1 hand. Wait, and they waited. These officers are going to need to take you, she said to Raymond. That's what's going to happen. I can't change that part. But I want you to know that I am going to Sandra's office the moment you leave this corridor. I am going to start the external review process today. I am going to make sure Cora's oncologist knows what's happening. And I am going to come to Cora's room and tell her that her dad loves her very much and that there are people working to help her. He stood up. He looked at Jolene Briggs, who was a pediatric nurse in teal scrubs with a dinosaur charm on her stethoscope, who had been a combat medic for 8 years and who had sat on the floor of a corridor in a children's hospital and listened to him for 22 minutes. He said, "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I've got a lot of phone calls to make." She made the phone calls. She made the first one from the corridor, before she had even processed what the previous 40 minutes had contained, because the external review request had a business hours deadline and business hours were ending, and she was not going to let that deadline pass. Sandra, the patient advocate, answered on the second ring. Jolene gave her the situation in 30 seconds. Sandra said she had been aware of the third-tier option, but had not had time to explain it to Raymond before the situation developed. She was on it. She would have the paperwork started within the hour. The second call was to Cora's oncologist, who was not at the hospital that day but who answered her cell phone. Because oncologists who cared about their patients answered their cell phones. Jolene explained what had happened and what the external review process would involve and what the oncologist's participation in that process needed to look like. The oncologist knew exactly what it needed to look like. She had done this before. She was angry. Jolene could hear the specific anger of a physician who had watched a patient's family fight a denial that should never have been issued, and she channeled the anger into the specific efficiency of someone who knew exactly what to do with it. The third call was to a legal aid attorney she had the number for. The attorney specialized in insurance denials in healthcare contexts. She took the case summary Jolene gave her in 12 minutes and said she would be in contact with the family by the end of the day. Then Jolene went and washed her hands. She leaned over the sink in the nurse's station bathroom, and she breathed, the specific deliberate breath of someone who has been running at maximum capacity and needs 30 seconds to come down to a sustainable level. 30 seconds. She dried her hands. She went to the medication room and she managed the room 3 situation. Marcus's oxygen saturation, as she had known, had self-corrected, but she did the check anyway, because the check was the job regardless of what else had been happening. She went to Cora's room. Cora was awake. She had been awake, Jolene suspected, for much of the previous hour. The corridor was adjacent to her room, and while Jolene did not know exactly what Cora had heard, she knew that Cora was a perceptive 7-year-old, and perceptive 7-year-olds noticed when the ward was unusual. "Hey," Jolene said. Cora said. She was making a paper bird from a square of origami paper. She had become interested in origami 2 weeks ago, and had progressed rapidly. Jolene sat in the chair beside the bed. She looked at the paper bird in progress. "Your dad was here today," she said. Cora looked up from the bird. "I know," she said. "I heard the thing in the hall." Jolene nodded. She had thought about how to do this. She had decided that Cora deserved the same thing every patient Jolene had ever had deserved, the truth at the level they could hold it. "Your dad has been working very hard," Jolene said, "to get you the treatment that Dr. Freeman thinks will help you most. You know that." The insurance said no, Cora said. She said it the way 7-year-olds said things they had overheard and absorbed, factually, the emotion held separately. "They said no twice," Jolene said. "Your dad has been fighting that. Today he got very frustrated and scared, and something happened that he didn't mean to have happened. He's okay. He loves you very much. He's going to have to deal with some consequences of what happened today, but he's okay." Cora looked at the paper bird. She folded one wing. "Is he in trouble?" she said. "Some," Jolene said. "Yes, because of me. Because he loves you more than he knows what to do with," Jolene said. "And because the system that was supposed to help you has been very hard and very unfair. And he ran out of ways to fight it the normal way. That happens to people who love someone very much and feel like they can't protect them." Cora was quiet for a moment. "Is the insurance still going to say no?" she said. "We are working on that right now," Jolene said. "Several people are working on it. I am working on it. There's a step we haven't tried yet that we're trying today." Cora looked at her. "Do you think it'll work?" she said. This was the question. The one that a lesser person would have answered falsely in either direction, either false reassurance or false despair. Jolene held it for a moment. "I think we have a real shot," she said. "I think the people working on it are good at what they do, and they believe in your case. I think your doctor is very clear about what you need and very willing to fight for it. And I think that the person who reviews the appeal from outside the insurance company is going to look at your file and make the right decision. You think, or you know," Cora said. "I think," Jolene said. "I don't know. I'm not going to tell you I know when I think." Cora considered this with the seriousness of a child who had been in a hospital for 3 weeks and had developed in that time a finely calibrated detector for adults who were being straight with her. "Okay," she said. She went back to the paper bird. Jolene sat with her for a while, not doing anything clinical, just present. The way she sat with patients who needed someone to be present. After a few minutes, Cora held up the finished bird. "For you," she said. Jolene took it. It was a crane, not perfectly proportioned, the wings slightly uneven, the head bent at an angle that cranes did not naturally achieve. It was completely itself. "Thank you," Jolene said. "You gave my dad coffee," Cora said, "when nobody else did." Raymond Hayes was charged. She had been honest with Cora about this, and she was as honest with herself about it. What had happened in that corridor had consequences, and the consequences were real, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. He was charged with 2 counts of reckless endangerment and 1 count of criminal possession. His attorney, the legal aid attorney Jolene had called, who had agreed to represent him pro bono within 2 hours of Jolene's call, filed for consideration of mitigating circumstances. The police commander who had managed the scene wrote a letter that included specific reference to the fact that no one had been threatened directly and that the individual had cooperated fully once a rapport was established. Jolene wrote a letter too. She described what she had observed in the corridor. She described Raymond Hayes as she had experienced him, a man who had been failed by a system for 19 days, and who had broken under the weight of it in a way that was human and comprehensible, and that she did not condone and did not excuse and believed needed to be understood in its full context. She did not know what the outcome of the charges would be. She had been honest with herself about the limits of her influence in this territory. What she did know, the external review was filed the same day. The independent reviewer was assigned within 48 hours. The review took 6 days. On the 7th day, the reviewer's decision arrived. The treatment was medically necessary, and the denial was overturned. Cora began the targeted therapy 11 days after the corridor. Jolene was on the floor the morning the first treatment was administered. She was not assigned to Cora's room for that shift. The oncology team was managing the treatment initiation. But she was on the floor, and she checked in before the treatment and after, and she sat with Cora's mother in the waiting area for 20 minutes in between. Cora's mother had wanted to thank her. Jolene had said, "Don't thank me yet. Let's see how the treatment works first." 3 weeks after the first treatment, the assessment showed what Dr. Freeman had predicted it would show. The trend was moving in the right direction. Jolene was at the nurse's station when the oncologist came to tell Cora. She could hear from where she sat the sound that came from Cora's room, not the specific words, but the sound. The specific sound of good news arriving in a room where it was very much needed. She finished writing the chart she was writing. She allowed herself exactly 1 moment, 1 full, complete, unguarded moment of feeling what the moment contained. Then she went to check on Marcus, who had opinions about the lunch options that needed to be managed. After her shift that day, the day the good news came from Cora's room, Jolene walked home through the squares. This was her practice. She had done it since she came to work at Savannah Children's. Walked home through the squares when the weather allowed, which in Savannah it allowed more often than not, and let the walking be the transition between the hospital and the rest of her life. The squares did what they had always done. They slowed her down. They made her look. She walked through Chippewa Square, where the live oaks were old enough that the roots had long ago made peace with the cobblestones, and the cobblestones had long ago made peace with the roots, each working around the other in the specific accommodation of things that had been in the same place long enough to stop fighting. She walked through Madison Square, past the fountain. She walked through Monterey Square, where the monument stood and the benches faced the street, and a couple was sitting on one of them, close together, watching the evening come. She thought about the corridor, about Raymond Hayes on the floor with his face in his hands, about what it had taken to get him there, not to that moment of crisis, but to the earlier moment, the one before the crisis, the 19 days of fighting and losing. She thought about the systems, the way they were built and the way they failed, and the specific people who fell through the gaps, and the specific people who had to decide what to do when someone they cared for fell through one. She thought about Afghanistan, about the specific and various ways that people broke under impossible pressure, and the specific and various things that had helped and the things that had not. She had spent 8 years being the person who arrived after the breaking, who saw people at their most fractured and who put her hands on the fracture and tried to hold things together until something more permanent could be arranged. She was still doing this. The specific form had changed. The scrubs instead of the uniform, the pediatric ward instead of the forward operating base, the insurance appeal instead of the medevac. But the essential thing was the same: finding the person who was broken, staying with them, holding things together with what she had until something more permanent could be arranged. She had been doing this since she was 20 years old. She thought about whether she was tired. She looked at the square around her, the live oaks, the Spanish moss, the evening light coming gold through the canopy. She was not tired. She examined this honestly, exactly as full as she should be. Not empty, full. The way a person was full after a day that had asked everything, and to which they had given everything. It was not the fullness of satisfaction, exactly or not only. It was the fullness of having been fully used. She was the person who could do what she did. She had always been that person. The army had confirmed it. The nursing program had redirected it. Cora's ward had given it a home. She reached into her pocket, the paper crane. Cora's paper crane, slightly imperfect, completely itself. She held it in her palm. The savannah evening around her. The squares. The live oaks. The smell of the river a few blocks east. She had carried things for a long time. Carried them the way she had learned to carry things in the field, without putting them down, because there was never a good moment to put them down, because the next thing always arrived before you had processed the previous one. She thought, maybe this was a good moment. Not to stop, but to set down, gently, the specific weight of 8 years of combat medicine, to acknowledge, in the quiet of a savannah square at evening, that it had been heavy, and that she had carried it correctly, and that she did not need to keep carrying it in quite the same way. She had found what she was looking for. She had found what was on the other side of the edge she had spent 8 years running toward. It was here. In this city, in this hospital, in these children, in Cora's imperfect paper crane in her palm. She closed her hand around it. She walked home through savannah, which was the same as it had always been, the squares and the oaks and the Spanish moss and the river. And she was the same as she had always been, which is to say, someone who knew what it meant to stay, and who stayed, and who would keep staying for as long as staying was what was needed. It would always be what was needed. She was the right person for it. She had known this for a long time. Now she was sure. If you love this type of intense nurse-taking action tales, hit that like button. Share the video with your fellow thrill seekers, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you never miss a new story.